The air in the great hall of Noctis was so cold it felt solid, a presence that settled deep in Alara's lungs and refused to leave. It smelled of ancient stone, of dust that had danced in moonbeams for 1,000 years, and of something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like frost on a winter rose. Her own world, the sun-drenched kingdom of Aurelia, had smelled of salt air and baked earth and citrus blossoms. Here, the very atmosphere was a negation of everything she had ever known. 6 days she had been in this fortress carved from the heart of a mountain, and in 6 days, she had not once felt warm. Her wedding gown was a masterpiece of Aurelian silk, spun with threads of captured sunlight, but it offered no protection against the eternal twilight of this realm. It felt like a costume for a play she had not auditioned for, the story of a girl sacrificed to a shadow. Standing before the obsidian throne, she felt the weight of every eye in the assembled court. They were not human eyes. They were the eyes of predators, ancient and patient, their gazes like the touch of cold fingers on her skin. They saw not a bride, not a queen, but a treaty made flesh, a fragile vessel of warm blood to seal an alliance. And then there was him. Caitian, the vampire king. He had not looked at her, not truly, since she had been delivered to his borders like a tribute. He stood beside her now, a figure of impossible stillness and grace, carved from night and power. His nearness was an oppression, a physical pressure that made the air thin. The silver circlet on his brow seemed to absorb what little light there was, and his hair was a fall of absolute black against the stark white of his skin. When he had taken her hand to lead her to the dais, his touch had been brief, impersonal, and colder than the stone beneath her feet. It was the touch of a king claiming a possession, not a husband greeting his wife. The high priest, a vampire so old his skin was like translucent parchment stretched over bone, droned on in a language that felt like stones grinding together. The words meant nothing to Alara. The only language she understood in this moment was the hammering of her own heart, a frantic, mortal drumbeat in a hall of silent chests. She kept her gaze fixed on a point just beyond the throne, on a tapestry depicting a sky without a sun, where silver constellations burned with cold fire. To look at him was to invite annihilation. To look at the court was to see her own insignificance reflected in 100 pairs of ancient, unblinking eyes. Do you, Alara of Aurelia, accept this union, binding your blood to the blood of the eternal throne, your life to the life of its king? The priest's voice rasped, the words now in the common tongue, sharp and clear. Her throat was tight, a knot of fear and unshed tears. This was the culmination of her life, to be a bridge between the sun and the shadow, a promise of peace her people desperately needed. Her father's face, etched with worry and resignation, flashed in her mind. For our people, he had said, his voice heavy. For peace. She forced the word from her lips. I do. It was a whisper, a thread of sound swallowed by the vast, vaulted emptiness of the hall. The priest turned his desiccated head toward the king. And do you, Caitian, lord of Noctis, master of the eternal throne, accept this union, binding the blood of the sun to your own, her life to your eternal reign? Caitian did not hesitate. His voice was not loud, but it filled the space completely, a low, resonant sound that vibrated through the floor and up into Alara's bones. I do. There was no warmth in it, no emotion at all. It was the sound of a decree being issued, a transaction being finalized. He turned his head then, and for the first time, his eyes met hers fully. They were the color of twilight, a deep, bruised violet that held no light within them. And in their depths, she saw it. Not malice, not cruelty, but something far more chilling, a profound and absolute indifference. He was looking at her, but he was not seeing a person. He was seeing a symbol, a clause in a treaty, an object. The sight of her, in her sun-spun dress, seemed to bore him. He lifted her hand. His fingers were long and cool, their strength effortless as they closed around hers. He brought it not to his lips, but merely held it before him, his thumb brushing over her knuckles with the dispassionate curiosity of a scholar examining a specimen. Then he let it drop. The gesture was a dismissal. It said, "This is done. You are mine. You are nothing." A wave of dizziness washed over her. The cold of the hall deepened, seeping into her marrow. This was not a marriage. It was an acquisition. And in the cold, violet eyes of her new husband, she saw her future stretching out before her, an eternity of being owned but never seen, of being present but never known. The silence that followed the vows was heavier than any sound, a final, suffocating blanket laid over her old life. The king turned away from her, facing his court, and the moment was over. She was his queen, and she had never been more alone. The days that followed bled into one another, a seamless tapestry of grey dawns and black nights. Ilara was given chambers that were opulent in their gloom, furnished with dark, heavy woods and velvets the colour of dried blood. A vast, arched window looked out not upon a sky, but upon the cavernous heart of the mountain, where phosphorescent fungi cast an eerie, blue-green glow on forests of crystalline rock. It was beautiful, in a stark and lifeless way. It was a tomb. Her ladies-in-waiting were vampires, ancient and silent women with faces like porcelain masks. They moved without a sound, their gestures economical and precise. They dressed her, brushed her hair, and laid out meals she could barely bring herself to eat, all in a silence that was both deferential and deeply unnerving. They answered her questions with brief, clipped sentences and never, ever met her eyes. She was their queen, but she was also a fragile, warm-blooded creature whose heart beat with a frantic, temporary rhythm that must have sounded like a hummingbird's wings to their preternatural hearing. Caitian was a phantom. He presided over his court, held audiences, and managed the affairs of his kingdom with a remote, chilling efficiency. Ilara was expected to sit beside his throne, a silent, decorative accessory. She would sit for hours on the cold, unforgiving stone, her hands folded in her lap, feeling the court's collective, dispassionate gaze upon her. He never spoke to her during these proceedings. He never looked at her. It was as if an invisible wall existed between their two thrones, a barrier of ice she could not hope to breach. Once, desperate for a flicker of connection, she had tried to speak to him as they walked the silent colonnades back to their separate wings of the castle. "The tapestries in the West Gallery," she began, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet, "they are magnificent. I have never seen such artistry." He did not slow his pace. "They depict the unmooring of the first clans," he said, his eyes fixed forward. "A necessary war. It seems so sorrowful," she ventured, thinking of the woven images of fire and loss. A beat of silence. "Sorrow is a mortal luxury, Your Majesty. We prefer victory. Your Majesty." He called her by her title, a title he had bestowed, as if she were a stranger, a foreign dignitary. The cold formality was more cutting than any insult. He was reminding her of her place. She was a political figurehead, not a person, and certainly not his wife. The conversation, if it could be called that, was over. He inclined his head in a gesture of dismissal and swept into his own chambers, the heavy oak door closing behind him with a sound of utter finality. She began to study him from her silent post at his side. She watched the way his long fingers rested on the arm of his throne, perfectly still for hours. She watched the subtle shift of his shoulders when a petitioner displeased him, the almost imperceptible narrowing of his violet eyes. He was a creature of immense control, his power held in a state of constant, perfect equilibrium. He was not cruel in the way of petty tyrants, he was not prone to fits of rage or capricious violence. His cruelty was colder, more profound. It was the cruelty of absolute detachment. On the 10th day of her marriage, she decided to make one last attempt. She had brought a few small treasures from Aurelia, packed away in a carved wooden chest. From it, she took a small, smooth piece of sea glass, worn into a perfect teardrop shape by a century of ocean tides. It was a pale, soft blue, the color of the sky at her home just after sunrise. It was a simple thing, worthless, but it was a piece of her. She found him in the royal library, a cavernous space where the air smelled of aging paper and leather. He was standing before a vast map of the known world, his back to her. She hesitated in the doorway, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. "My lord," she said softly. He turned, his expression unreadable. "Your Majesty." She stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she held out the small piece of glass on her palm. I brought this for you. From my home. The sea polishes them on our shores. I thought you might like to see a piece of the sunlit world." Her voice faltered at the end. It sounded so foolish, so naive. He looked down at her offering. His gaze lingered on the sea glass for a long, silent moment. She held her breath, a fragile bud of hope unfurling in her chest. Perhaps this small, simple thing could bridge the chasm between them. He reached out, and for a heart-stopping second, she thought he would take it. Instead, his fingers brushed past her hand to gesture at the map on the wall. "Your sunlit world," he said, his voice flat, "is now a vassal state, secured by this union. Its value has been calculated. I have no need for its trinkets." The hope in her chest withered and died. He had not even looked at her face. He had seen only the political reality, the map, the transaction. The small piece of glass in her palm suddenly felt heavy and cold, a foolish child's toy. She closed her fingers around it, the smooth edges digging into her skin. She looked at him, truly looked at the ancient, beautiful, and impossibly empty creature before her, and she understood. He would never see her. He would never know her. To him, she was a trinket, a piece of a larger acquisition, and he had no interest in the thing itself. She turned without another word and walked away, the sea glass clutched so tightly in her hand it felt as if it might draw blood. Back in her chambers, she did not cry. The time for tears was over. The cold of this place had finally seeped into her bones, and in the chill, a new and unfamiliar feeling was taking root, not despair, but resolve. A hard, sharp, crystalline resolve. He had acquired a queen, but he had misjudged the acquisition. She was not a trinket to be set on a shelf and forgotten. She was Ilara of Aurelia. And she would not be owned. For the next 3 weeks, Ilara became a ghost in the castle of Noctis. She performed her duties as queen with a placid, unreadable expression. She sat by Caitian's side at court, a portrait of serene obedience. She ate the food laid before her, walked the cold halls, and retired to her chambers without complaint. To the vampires of the court, she had finally settled into her role, the fire of her mortal spirit banked and cooled by the eternal chill of their world. They were mistaken. Beneath the calm facade, Ilara's mind was a whirlwind of activity. She spent every spare moment in the castle's archives, a lesser-used library filled with treaties, law books, and the histories of the vampire clans. Her ladies-in-waiting assumed she was merely seeking to educate herself on her new kingdom's history, a commendable if ultimately pointless endeavor for a mortal queen. They left her alone, surrounded by towering shelves of ancient, brittle scrolls and leather-bound tomes. She pored over the marriage treaty that bound Aurelia to Noctis, a document thick with clauses and subclauses written in dense, legalistic language. Her father's negotiators had been desperate, and it showed. The terms were heavily weighted in Noctis's favor. But Ilara was not looking for fairness. She was looking for a flaw, a crack, a single loose thread in the tightly woven legal fabric. Her fingers, stained with ink and dust, traced the lines of ancient script day after day. She learned of vampire law, a rigid and unforgiving code that valued tradition and precedent above all else. And it was there, in a dusty codex detailing the rights of union between a vampire lord and a mortal, that she found it. An addendum, centuries old, added after a disastrous marriage to a human princess from a long-forgotten kingdom. A union of the blood and the sun, the text read, requires more than vow and ceremony. It requires a true joining. Should the union remain unconsummated by the passing of the first full moon, it is deemed a political shell, void of the spiritual binding necessary for legitimacy. The mortal party, in such a case, holds the right of annulment, to be declared before the throne and the court, lest her soul remain tethered to an empty promise. Ilara's breath caught. The first full moon. It had passed 5 nights ago. The treaty, in the vampire's ancient and unyielding law, was already a shell. Caitian, in his arrogance and indifference, had neglected the one detail that truly mattered. He had secured her presence, but he had not secured the union itself. He had not thought it necessary. He had not thought she was necessary, beyond her signature on a document. A slow, cold smile touched her lips for the first time in a month. It was a sharp, unfamiliar expression on her own face. She read the passage again and again, committing it to memory. The law was clear. The right was hers. All that was required was the courage to claim it. She spent the next 2 days in quiet preparation. She gathered the few things that were truly hers, the the sea glass, a small book of Aurelian poetry, a miniature portrait of her parents. She stitched a small, hidden pocket into the lining of a simple, dark traveling cloak and filled it with the handful of gold coins she had brought with her. It was not much, but it would have to be enough. She studied the maps in the library, tracing a path through the treacherous mountain passes that led east, away from Noctis, toward the neutral territories of the Free Marches. It would be a difficult, dangerous journey, but the thought of it filled her not with fear, but with a wild, surging hope. On the morning of the 34th day of her marriage, she dressed herself. She did not choose one of the opulent gowns the court provided. Instead, she wore a simple woolen dress, the color of slate, practical and unadorned. She braided her hair tightly, functionally. When her ladies-in-waiting saw her, they exchanged confused glances, but her serene expression brooked no questions. She walked to the great hall, where the morning court was in session. Her steps were steady, her head held high. The guards at the door moved to block her. The queen was not to enter unescorted, but she met their gaze with a cool authority they had never seen from her before, and they faltered. She swept past them and into the hall. A hush fell over the assembled courtiers. All eyes turned to her. Caitian, seated on the obsidian throne, looked up, a flicker of annoyance crossing his perfect features. It was the most emotion she had ever seen from him. She did not wait for him to speak. She walked to the center of the hall, to the very spot where she had stood on her wedding day, and she turned to face him. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs, but her voice, when she spoke, was clear and cold as the mountain air. Caitian, Lord of Noctis, she began, her voice ringing with newfound strength. I stand before you and this court to invoke the ancient laws of union. Caitian's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward slightly, a predator sensing a disturbance in its territory. Explain yourself, madam. The law states, Elara continued, her gaze unwavering, that a marriage between one of your blood and one of mine, if unconsummated after the passing of the first full moon, is rendered a hollow pact. It is a political shell, lacking the spiritual binding required for legitimacy. A murmur rippled through the court. Caitian's face was a mask of stone, but she saw a dangerous light kindle in the depths of his violet eyes. He had not known. Or he had known, and forgotten, deeming it an irrelevant detail concerning a temporary creature. His arrogance had been her key. The law grants the mortal party, in this case, the right of annulment, she declared, her voice rising in power and conviction. A right I claim now. Before this throne and this court, I, Elara of Aurelia, declare this union void. The treaty is broken. The marriage is annulled. For a moment, there was absolute silence. The vampires of the court stared, their ancient faces frozen in shock. No one defied the king of Noctis. No one. Caitian rose slowly from his throne. The air in the hall grew thick, heavy with a pressure that felt like it could crack stone. His power uncoiled, a palpable, menacing force. You dare, he whispered, and the sound was more terrifying than any shout. Elara stood her ground. She met his furious gaze without flinching. For the first time, he was truly seeing her, and what he saw was not a docile bride, but an adversary. I dare what the law permits, she said calmly. I am no longer your queen. I am a free citizen of Aurelia, and I wish to return to my home. He took a step down from the dais. You belong to me. The treaty. The treaty is void because its central condition was not met, she cut him off, a reckless courage surging through her. You were so certain of your power, you neglected your duty. You acquired a bride, but you failed to make a wife. The failure is yours, Lord Caitian. The freedom is mine. With that, she turned her back on him, on the throne, on the court, on the entire kingdom of shadows. She walked, her back straight, toward the great doors of the hall. Every step was an act of will, expecting at any moment to feel his cold grip on her shoulder, to be struck down by his wrath. But nothing came. The court was frozen in disbelief. The king, for the first time in centuries, was stunned into inaction. She reached the doors. The guards, their faces a mixture of fear and awe, did not move to stop her. She pushed the heavy doors open and stepped out into the cold, grey corridor. She did not run. She walked, with measured steps, away from the great hall, her heart singing a wild, terrifying, and triumphant song of freedom. The castle was a labyrinth of stone and shadow, but Ilara had spent her weeks of captivity well. She had not just been reading lore, she had been learning the castle's rhythms, its passages, the shift changes of the guards. She moved now with a quiet purpose that belied the frantic beating of her heart. She kept to the servant corridors and forgotten stairwells, a small, grey shadow in the belly of the beast. The travelling cloak she had hidden was retrieved from beneath her mattress, its dark wool a welcome anonymity. She pulled the hood low over her face, shrouding her human features, her sun-touched hair. Every sound was magnified, every flicker of a torch a potential discovery. The scrape of her boots on the stone, the whisper of her cloak against the wall, the ragged sound of her own breath all seemed impossibly loud in the tomb-like silence. She imagined Caitian's rage, the order for her capture echoing through the halls. She imagined the guards, their swift, silent movements, their ancient eyes searching the shadows for her. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but determination was a fire in her blood. The image of his face, the shock, the fury, the dawning comprehension fueled her steps. She had torn a hole in his perfect, orderly world, and the thrill of it was a heady wine. She made her way to the lower levels, toward the kitchens and the service entrance that led to the refuse tunnels. It was a foul, undignified route, but she knew it would be the last place they would expect a former queen, to go. The air grew thick with the smell of waste and rot, but it was the smell of escape. She found the iron grate she had noted days before, a loose hinge her only hope. With trembling fingers, she worked the rusty pin free. It groaned in protest, a sound that made her freeze, her ears straining against the silence. But no alarm was raised. She squeezed through the narrow opening and into the darkness of the tunnels. The tunnel was slick with damp and filth, and the darkness was absolute. She fumbled for the small tinderbox and candle she had secreted away, her hands clumsy with cold and adrenaline. The small flame flickered to life, casting a tiny, wavering pool of light that pushed back the oppressive blackness. The tunnel stretched before her, a gaping maw leading out of the mountain. It was her only way out. The journey through the mountain was a nightmare. The air was frigid and foul, the ground uneven and treacherous. Rats skittered in the darkness just beyond her light. Twice, she had to douse her candle and press herself into a crevice as the sound of armored boots echoed from passages far above, the sounds of a search beginning in earnest. She waited, her body rigid, until the sounds faded, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she was sure they could hear it. Hours crawled by. Her legs ached, her lungs burned from the cold, foul air, but she pushed onward, driven by the memory of Caitian's indifferent eyes. That indifference had been her cage, and she would crawl through hell itself to be free of it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she saw it, a faint, grey luminescence ahead. The end of the tunnel. She emerged, blinking, into the pre-dawn gloom of the valley floor. The air was sharp and clean, smelling of pine and cold rock, and it was the sweetest scent she had ever known. She was out. She was out of the mountain, out of the fortress of Noctis. She looked back at the towering peak, a black fang against the bruised purple of the sky, and a shiver of terror and triumph ran through her. But she was not safe yet. She was still in his kingdom, a vast, sparsely populated land of dark forests and jagged hills, all patrolled by his loyal subjects. She had to cross the border into the free marches before he could truly find her. She pulled her cloak tighter, consulted the crude map she had drawn on a scrap of parchment, and set off, moving as quickly as she could into the cover of the ancient, black-limbed forest that blanketed the foothills. The sun never truly rose here. The sky merely lightened from black to a perpetual, bruised twilight, the weak light filtered through a permanent canopy of grey clouds. The forest was an eerie, silent place, the trees ancient and gnarled, their branches heavy with moss. The ground was a soft carpet of pine needles that muffled her footsteps. For 2 days, she traveled, eating the stale bread and dried fruit she had stuffed in her pockets, drinking from icy mountain streams. She slept in short, fitful bursts, hidden in hollow logs or beneath rocky overhangs, waking at the slightest sound, the snap of a twig, the cry of a night bird. On the 3rd day, she reached the edge of his domain. The border was marked by a series of grim, iron watchtowers and a swift, dark river that carved a deep gorge through the landscape. The bridge was heavily guarded. Crossing there was impossible. She followed the river downstream for miles, searching for another way. She found it in a place where the gorge narrowed, and a massive, fallen pine tree formed a precarious, natural bridge across the chasm. It was terrifying. The log was slick with moss and dew, and the river roared 100 feet below, a torrent of black water and white foam. But on the other side lay freedom. Taking a deep breath, Ilara started across. She didn't dare look down, focusing only on her footing, one slow, careful step at a time. The wind howled through the gorge, trying to tear her from her perch. Halfway across, she heard it, the baying of hounds. A deep, chilling sound that echoed off the canyon walls. They were close. Panic seized her. Her foot slipped. She cried out, flailing, her arms pinwheeling as she fought for balance. For a heart-stopping moment, she teetered on the brink, the roar of the river filling her ears. Then her boots found purchase again. Galvanized by fear, she scrambled the rest of the way across, collapsing onto the rocky ground of the far side, her body shaking, her lungs heaving. She looked back. On the other side of the gorge, dark figures on horseback had emerged from the trees. Even from this distance, she could feel their cold, predatory attention fixed on her. They could not cross here. For now, she was safe. She had done it. She pushed herself to her feet and, without a backward glance, plunged into the forests of the free marches. She was exhausted, terrified, and utterly alone, but a fierce, exhilarating joy coursed through her. Every aching muscle, every ragged breath, was a testament to her victory. She was free. In the great hall of Noctis, the silence was a living thing. It was absolute, heavier than stone, broken only by the sound of a single piece of sea glass shattering against the far wall. Caitian stood where Ilara had left him, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, the knuckles white. The shard of blue glass, a thing of sun and sea, lay in pieces on the dark stone floor, a symbol of his colossal failure. His court remained frozen, their immortal faces a gallery of shock and disbelief. They waited for his command, for the rage that would shake the mountain to its foundations. For centuries, his will had been law, his word, gospel. To be defied was an alien concept. To be defied by her, the little mortal queen, the fragile piece of a political bargain, was an impossibility that had just occurred. He turned slowly, his violet eyes sweeping over the assembled vampires. There was no shouting, no explosive rage. There was only a cold, lethal pressure that emanated from him, making the very air crackle. "Find her," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Bring her back." The command broke the spell. Guards and courtiers bowed and melted away into the shadows, their movements swift and silent, eager to obey, to restore the order she had shattered. Within minutes, the hall was empty, save for him. He walked to the window, the same one she had so often looked out of, and stared into the phosphorescent gloom of the mountain's heart. "You were so certain of your power, you neglected your duty." Her words echoed in the cavernous silence of his mind. They were true. He had seen her as a contract, not a person. Her presence was all the treaty required, and he had assumed her compliance was part of the bargain. He had not considered her will, her thoughts, her soul. He had not considered her at all. This feeling, it was unfamiliar. It was not just the sting of wounded pride, though that was certainly present, a hot, sharp thing beneath his ribs. It was something else. A hollowness. The castle, which had been his sanctuary and his fortress for 1,000 years, suddenly felt empty. Her absence was a presence. He found himself remembering the faint, warm scent of her skin, the sound of her soft human footsteps in the corridors, the way the light from the glowing fungi caught in her sun-colored hair. Details he had registered but never acknowledged, never valued. He had been king for so long. He had forgotten what it was to deal with a creature that could not be commanded, that operated on a different axis of logic and emotion. He understood power, loyalty, fear, and ambition. He did not understand why she would risk death for a principle, why she would prefer a dangerous freedom to a safe, gilded cage. He did not understand why her rejection of that cage felt like a personal condemnation. Days passed. His trackers were the best in the world, his guards relentless. They followed her trail to the border, to the gorge with the fallen tree. And there, they lost her. She had vanished into the sprawling, ungoverned lands of the Free Marches, a place where his authority meant nothing. His patrols returned empty-handed, their reports filled with frustration. She was gone. The hollowness in his chest deepened. The court settled back into its ancient rhythms, but something had irrevocably changed. The balance of power had been disturbed. A mortal had defied the eternal king and had, for now, won. The whispers in the shadows were constant. One evening, a week after her escape, he found himself standing before the door to her chambers. He had not been inside since she had arrived. On impulse, he pushed the door open. The room was cold and neat, stripped of her presence by the servants. But something remained. A faint scent of dried flowers and parchment. He walked to her dressing table. A single book of poetry lay there, left behind in her haste. He picked it up. It was worn, the cover soft from frequent handling. He opened it to a random page. The words were about the sea, about the endless patience of the waves and the freedom of the horizon. He closed the book, his fingers tracing the worn leather. This was a part of her world, a world he had dismissed as a trick. He had held the sun in his hands and had been so blinded by its political value that he had failed to feel its warmth. A decision formed in the cold stillness of his mind. This was not a matter for his guards or his trackers. This was not a matter of state, not anymore. It was personal. He needed to understand. He needed to find her, not to drag her back as a prisoner, but to stand before her and ask the question that burned in the silent spaces of his soul. Why? He would not send an army. He would not send his court. He would go himself. The thought was unprecedented, reckless. A king did not simply abandon his throne to chase a runaway bride across foreign lands. But he was more than a king. He was an ancient, powerful creature who had just been shown a piece of the world he did not understand, and his pride, his curiosity, his something else, something he refused to name, demanded that he pursue it. He returned to his own chambers and stripped off his regal attire. He dressed in the simple, dark leathers of a traveler. He strapped a sword to his back, a formality, as he rarely needed one. He would travel as he had in his youth, centuries ago, before the crown had settled on his brow and encased him in layers of responsibility and isolation. He would travel as Caitian, not as the king of Noctis. He left the castle by a secret passage, melting into the twilight without a word to his court. The hunt was on. But this time, the prey was not a political asset to be reclaimed. It was a mystery to be solved. And the hunter was as lost as the hunted. The town of Silver Creek was nestled in a quiet valley in the easternmost part of the Free Marches, a place of green fields and a slow-moving river that glittered in the afternoon sun. It was a world away from the oppressive grandeur of Noctis. Here, the air smelled of damp earth, baking bread, and wood smoke. The light was soft and golden, the sounds were of laughter from the tavern, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, and the lowing of cattle. For Elara, it was paradise. She had traveled for 3 weeks, selling the last of her gold coins for passage on a merchant's cart, keeping her head down and her story simple. She was Ellen, a scribe's assistant from the south whose master had passed away, seeking new employment. Her story was vague enough to be plausible and sad enough to discourage further questions. In Silver Creek, she found work with the town's apothecary, a kind, elderly woman named Lyra whose hands were gnarled with arthritis but whose mind was sharp as a needle. Elara's days fell into a simple, soothing rhythm. She would wake with the sun, its warm rays a welcome balm on her skin. She would help Lyra grind herbs, roll pills, and bottle tinctures. The work was methodical and calming. She learned the names of plants, witch hazel and comfrey, yarrow and lungwort. Her hands, once soft and useless, grew calloused and capable. In the evenings, she would read by candlelight in the small room above the shop that Lyra had given her, the book of Aurelian poetry, her only link to her past. For the first time in her life, she felt a sense of ownership over her own existence. She was not Princess Elara, a political pawn. She was not Queen Elara, a decorative object. She was Ellen, a woman who earned her own bread and slept soundly through the night, unafraid of the cold touch of an indifferent husband. The fear of pursuit began to fade, replaced by a quiet, steady peace. She was a nameless face in a town of nameless faces, safe in her anonymity. And yet, the past was a shadow that lingered at the edges of her new life. Sometimes, a tall, dark-haired stranger passing in the street would make her heart leap into her throat. A sudden silence in the tavern would make her skin prickle with a familiar dread. At night, she sometimes dreamed of violet eyes and a voice like stones grinding together, and she would wake with her heart pounding, the cold of Noctis clinging to her like a shroud. She knew she was not truly free. She had escaped the cage, but the shadow of the keeper was long. She had been in Silver Creek for 2 months when the seasons began to turn. The golden light of late summer was giving way to the crisp, cooler air of autumn. One evening, she was returning from gathering herbs in the woods, a basket on her arm, the setting sun casting long shadows across the path. She felt a sudden chill, a drop in the air temperature that had nothing to do with the coming evening. The birds in the trees fell silent. The woods, usually alive with the hum of insects and the rustle of small animals, became unnaturally still. A primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her newfound peace. She knew that silence. It was the silence of a predator's presence, the absolute stillness that fell when the master of the food chain was near. She quickened her pace, her boots scattering fallen leaves. The path ahead was empty, but she could feel it. A presence. She was being watched. She broke into a run, her basket forgotten, its contents spilling onto the path. She burst from the woods and into the open fields that bordered the town, her lungs burning. She didn't look back. She ran for the warm, welcoming lights of Silver Creek as if running for her life. She reached the edge of town, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and risked a glance over her shoulder. The edge of the forest was dark and empty. There was nothing there. She stumbled back to the apothecary shop, her body trembling. Lyra took one look at her pale face and clucking, sat her down with a cup of hot chamomile tea. "Just a fright, dear," the old woman said kindly. "A trick of the light. The woods play games when the sun goes down." Ilara nodded, but she knew it wasn't a trick of the light. The feeling had been too specific, too familiar. The peace she had so carefully constructed was a fragile thing, and the first tremor had just shaken its foundations. He was looking for her. Maybe he hadn't found her yet, but his hunt had disturbed the world around her. The shadow was closing in. Caitian moved through the world of mortals like a ghost. He was a creature of twilight in a land of sun, and he found it garish, loud, and overwhelmingly alive. The scents were a chaotic assault on his senses: food cooking, animals, sweat, wood smoke, blooming flowers, all tangled together in a way that was both vibrant and unpleasant. The people were a constant source of irritation. They bustled and shouted, their emotions worn on their sleeves, their lives burning with a brief, frantic intensity that he found exhausting to behold. He traveled east, following the faintest whispers of a rumor. A noblewoman traveling alone. A beautiful stranger with hair the color of summer wheat. He followed a trail of false leads and dead ends, his patience, a thing he normally possessed in infinite measure, wearing thin. The mortal world was vast and chaotic, a haystack in which he was searching for one very specific, very clever needle. His appearance drew stares. Even in simple traveler's leathers, he could not hide what he was. His stillness, his pallor, the unnatural grace of his movements, they marked him as other. People gave him a wide berth, their fear a palpable scent in the air. It was an old, familiar feeling, but for the first time, it frustrated him. Fear was a barrier. It prevented him from getting the information he needed. He had to learn to soften his edges, to move in a way that was less predatory, to speak in a tone that was less commanding. It was like learning a foreign language, and he was a clumsy student. He learned to listen. He would sit in the corner of a noisy tavern, nursing a single cup of wine for hours, and simply absorb the flow of conversation around him. He learned about crop prices and local gossip, about marriages and feuds and festivals. It was a tapestry of small, insignificant lives, and yet, it was the world she had fled to. To find her, he had to understand it. He finally picked up her trail in a dusty little town on the border of the marches. A merchant recalled giving a ride to a quiet, sad-eyed young woman who paid with a gold coin from a kingdom he didn't recognize. He had dropped her at a crossroads, and she had headed east. The trail led him, finally, to the valley of Silver Creek. He stood on a ridge overlooking the town as dusk fell, the place a small pool of warm light in the darkening landscape. It was a peaceful, insignificant little town. It was exactly the kind of place she would choose. He did not enter the town immediately. He spent a day observing it from the cover of the woods, his senses attuned to the rhythm of the place. He watched the people come and go, his violet eyes scanning every face. And then, he saw her. She was walking out of the woods, a basket on her arm. Her hair was braided simply, and she wore a plain, homespun dress. She was no longer a princess or a queen. She was just a woman. And she was smiling, a small, quiet smile of contentment as she examined an herb in her hand. He had never seen her smile before. The sight of it struck him with an unexpected force. It was like a punch to the gut. This was what she had wanted. This simple, sunlit peace. This was what he had denied her, what his world could never offer. In that moment, he understood that dragging her back to Noctis would be an act of supreme cruelty. It would be destroying this small, fragile happiness she had built for herself. He watched her, his body perfectly still. As she started back toward the town, he let a fraction of his presence be known, a subtle drop in the temperature, a sudden silencing of the woods. It was a test. Her reaction was immediate. The smile vanished. Her head snapped up. Fear, sharp and familiar, radiated from her. She dropped her basket and ran. He did not follow. He watched her flee, his expression unreadable. He had found her. But the question was no longer how to bring her back. The question, now, was what to do. He could take her. He could appear in her room in the dead of night and carry her away, and no one in this town could stop him. But what would he have then? A terrified prisoner. The same silent, empty-eyed woman who had sat beside his throne. He would have the vessel, but the spirit, the thing that had smiled in the woods, would be gone. He waited until full darkness fell. He moved through the town like a shadow, his footsteps making no sound on the cobbled streets. He found the apothecary shop, a warm light glowing in an upstairs window. Her room. He could smell her scent on the air, a faint fragrance of herbs, soap, and something uniquely her, something warm and alive. He stood in the alley across the street for a long time, watching the light in her window. The hunter had cornered his prey. But for the first time in his very long life, he was not sure he wanted to make the kill. That night, Ilara did not sleep. She sat in the chair by her window, the book of poetry lying unopened in her lap, and watched the street below. Every shadow seemed to move, every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. The feeling from the woods had not dissipated, it had followed her. It was a weight in the air, a cold pressure that settled over the entire town. He was here. She didn't know how she knew, but she did. The peace of Silver Creek was shattered. She thought about running again. She could pack her small bag and be gone before dawn. But where would she go? He had found her here, in this remote and forgotten corner of the world. He would find her again. And again. Her escape had not bought her freedom, only a temporary reprieve. The running had to stop. The confrontation she had been dreading was inevitable. The candle on her table burned down, sputtering in a pool of wax. The moon rose, casting a pale, silvery light over the sleeping town. And then, the light in her room flickered. The flame of her new candle dipped and swayed as if in a sudden draught, though the window was closed. The air grew cold. She did not turn around. She knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, that she was no longer alone. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. She squeezed her eyes shut. Be brave, she told herself. You are not his property. You are not his queen. You are Ellen. You are Ilara. A floorboard creaked behind her. It was the only sound. He was giving her time, allowing her to acknowledge his presence. She took a slow, shaky breath and turned her chair around. He was standing in the center of her small room, a figure of darkness and silence. He wore simple traveler's clothes, but they did nothing to diminish the aura of immense power and antiquity that clung to him. His presence seemed to suck all the warmth and air from the space, his shoulders so broad they almost brushed the low-ceiling beams. The moonlight from the window caught in his black hair and illuminated the stark, pale beauty of his face. His violet eyes were fixed on her, and their expression was not one of rage or triumph. It was something she had never seen before, uncertainty. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was a battlefield, charged with 1,000 unspoken things. Her terror was a physical thing, a cold weight in her stomach, but beneath it, the resolve that had carried her out of Noctis began to harden once more. She would not scream. She would not cower. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice a little unsteady, but clear. He seemed to consider the question, as if he did not know the answer himself. He took a step closer, and she flinched, pressing herself back into her chair. He stopped immediately. The sight of her fear seemed to cause him a flicker of something. Pain. Regret. "I did not come to harm you," he said. His voice was the same low, resonant sound she remembered, but it lacked its usual edge of command. "Then why are you here?" she pressed, her courage growing. "To drag me back to my cage. I will not go." The cage, he repeated the word softly, tasting it. He looked around her humble room, the narrow bed, the small table with its books and drying herbs, the simple dress hanging on a peg. "You prefer this? This is my life," she said fiercely. "It is not a cage. It is a choice. Something you never gave me." He was silent again, his gaze intense. He seemed to be truly looking at her, seeing the capable woman in the simple dress, not the decorative princess in a silk gown. "Why?" he asked, and the single word was imbued with a genuine, aching curiosity. It was the question he had crossed kingdoms to ask. "Why did you leave?" The question, so simple and so direct, broke through her fear. It was the question he should have asked weeks ago, months ago. It was the question that proved he had never understood anything at all. A bubble of frustrated, incredulous laughter escaped her lips. "Why?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You truly do not know? I left because I was invisible. I left because I was a ghost in my own life. I sat beside you for a month, and you never once saw me. You saw a treaty. You saw a political convenience. You saw a warm-blooded pet to adorn your throne room. Did you ever once wonder what my thoughts were? What my hopes were? Did you even know the color of my eyes?" He did not answer, but the flicker in his own violet eyes told her everything. He did not know. "I left," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper, all her pain and humiliation pouring out, "because you placed a crown on my head but treated me as less than your lowest servant. At least them you acknowledged. Me, you simply ignored. I was nothing. A piece of furniture. And I would rather live in a hovel and be a person than in a palace and be a thing." She was breathing heavily, her chest tight with the force of her confession. She had finally said it. She had thrown the truth at him like a stone, and now she waited for the impact. He did not get angry. He did not defend himself. He simply stood there, absorbing her words, his beautiful face a mask of dawning, painful comprehension. He looked, for the first time, not like a king, not like a predator, but like a man who had just been handed a map to a country he never knew existed and was discovering that he was utterly, hopelessly lost. "I see," he said, and the words were quiet, heavy with a weight of centuries of solitude. And in that moment, the dynamic between them shifted irrevocably. He was the one who had come seeking something. He was the one who was vulnerable. And she, the runaway bride in her tiny, rented room, was the one with all the power. He did not leave. Ilara had expected him to vanish with the dawn, to return to his kingdom of shadows, but he remained. He did not stay in her room, of course. He found lodging at the town's only inn, taking the finest suite under an assumed name, Lord Cation becoming Master Kaz. The story he gave the innkeeper was that he was a scholar, researching the region's folklore. It was a thin disguise. No one in Silver Creek was fooled. They knew he was there for Ellen, the quiet girl at the apothecary, but no one knew why, and his dangerous aura kept their questions at bay. His presence changed the town. A subtle tension settled over the valley. People whispered. They looked at Ilara with a new mixture of fear and curiosity. She tried to continue her life as before, But it was impossible. The shadow she had been running from now walked the same streets she did. He was clumsy. It was the only word for it. He was a king trying to learn how to be a man, and he was failing spectacularly. He tried to speak to her. He would appear at the apothecary shop, a dark, incongruous figure among the bundled herbs and glass bottles, and attempt conversation. He would ask her about the plants, his questions stilted and academic. She would answer in curt, professional tones, refusing to meet his eyes, all too aware of Lyra watching them from the back room with a worried frown. One day, he brought her a gift. He presented her with a heavy velvet pouch. Inside was a cascade of perfect, flawless diamonds. They glittered in the afternoon sun, a king's ransom. A gift, he said, as if this explained everything. For your trouble. Ilara stared at the jewels, then up at his face. She saw no malice there, only a profound, almost tragic lack of understanding. She pushed the pouch back into his hand. I don't want your money, she said, her voice tight. You think you can buy my forgiveness? You think this is about wealth? He looked genuinely confused. It is what I have to offer. It is a measure of my regret. No, she said, shaking her head. It's a measure of how little you still understand. I don't want jewels. I wanted a conversation. I wanted you to ask me my name. I wanted you to look at me. She turned and went back to her work, leaving him standing there, holding a fortune in his hand like a fool's offering. He did not give up. He began to watch her, not with the eyes of a predator, but with the focused intensity of a student. He watched her talk with the village children, a gentle smile on her face. He watched her help Lyra, her hands now deft and sure as she ground herbs. He watched her read her book by the river, her expression lost and far away. He was studying the creature he had so carelessly dismissed, trying to piece together the puzzle of her. A week after his arrival, Ilara was walking by the river when a group of local youths, their courage bolstered by ale from the tavern, decided to confront her. They had grown tired of the stranger in their town and his unsettling interest in her. They cornered her, their faces sullen and suspicious. What's he to you, witch? One of them sneered. Did you summon him here with your potions? Ilara backed away, her heart starting to pound. Leave me alone. I've done nothing to you. You've brought a shadow on this town, another accused, stepping closer. We want you both gone. He reached out to grab her arm. Before his fingers could touch her, a blur of motion intervened. Cation was suddenly there, appearing as if from the very air between them. He had not run, he had simply arrived. He stood between Ilara and the youths, his back to her. He did not draw his sword. He did not even look at them. He simply stood there, his power rolling off him in palpable, suffocating waves. The air grew cold, the sunlight seemed to dim. The youths froze, their drunken bravado evaporating in the face of this silent, terrifying presence. They were staring into the eyes of a creature far older and more dangerous than anything in their worst nightmares. After a moment of paralyzed terror, they broke and ran, scrambling over each other to get away. Cation remained where he was for a long moment, the power slowly receding from him. Then, he turned to her. His face was grim. Are you all right? She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He had protected her. But it was the way he had done it, not with violence, but with pure, controlled presence. And he had asked if she was all right. He had shown concern. It was a small thing, but it was more than he had ever shown her in Noctis. They are afraid of what they do not understand, he said, his gaze following the fleeing boys. He looked back at her, and his violet eyes were filled with a strange, weary sadness. As, it seems, was I. It was the closest he had come to an apology. It was the first crack in the armor of his pride. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the terrifying king of Noctis, but a lonely, ancient being, trapped by his own power, fumbling his way toward a connection he desperately needed but had no idea how to build. Thank you, she whispered. He simply inclined his head, a gesture that was still regal but no longer dismissive. They stood in silence by the river as the sun began to set, no longer king and runaway, but two people from different worlds, caught in a fragile, uncertain truce. The negotiation had begun, not with words, but with a silent admission of failure and a quiet act of protection. The incident by the river marked a subtle shift. The truce held, fragile as a spider's web in morning dew. Cation ceased his clumsy attempts at conversation and gifts. Instead, he began to speak to her of himself. He would find her in the quiet moments of the evening, when she sat on the small bench behind the apothecary shop, and he would simply talk. He spoke of his own past, not as a king reciting his history, but as a man recounting his life. He told her of his childhood, centuries ago, in a world before the great vampire schisms, a world where his kind lived more openly, if not always peacefully, with mortals. He spoke of the endless parade of years, of watching friends and allies and enemies wither and die while he remained unchanged. He spoke of the isolation of the throne, the weight of immortality, the slow erosion of feeling until all that remained was duty and control. "We do not feel as you do," he explained one evening, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the rising moon. "Our emotions are geological. They move slowly, over centuries. Joy is a vein of gold one might find once in a millennium. Rage is a volcano, dormant for ages, then catastrophic. But mostly there is only stillness. A great, cold calm. When you arrived, you were a flicker. A brief, warm, agitating presence. I did not know what to do with you, so I chose to do nothing. I chose stillness." Ilara listened, rapt. For the first time, she was beginning to understand the creature behind the crown. He was not cruel by design, he was cruel by nature, by the very fabric of his being. He was a glacier, and she was a mayfly, and he had simply not known how to perceive something so fleeting and vibrant. In return, she found herself speaking of her own life. She told him of the sea in Aurelia, of the feeling of the sun on her skin, of her love for books and her dream of being a scholar. She spoke of her fear on their wedding day, her loneliness in his castle, the crushing weight of his indifference. She laid her heart bare, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. "This is who I was. This is what you did to me." He listened without interruption, his face a study in concentration. He was learning her, memorizing the details of her soul with the same intensity he had once applied to battle strategies and political treaties. One afternoon, Lyra sent Ilara to the high meadows to gather a rare mountain flower that only bloomed for a few weeks in the autumn. As she was making her way up the steep, rocky trail, the weather turned with shocking speed. The sky, clear moments before, became a mass of roiling grey clouds. A cold wind whipped through the pines, and a sudden, torrential rain began to fall. The path became a slick, muddy stream. She lost her footing on a patch of wet moss and tumbled down a short, steep embankment, her ankle twisting painfully beneath her. She cried out, a sharp gasp of pain. She tried to stand, but a searing agony shot up her leg. She was stranded, miles from the town, with a storm raging around her and a useless ankle. The cold was already seeping into her, and she knew that if she stayed here, exposed to the elements, she would not survive the night. Just as a true, chilling despair began to set in, he was there. He appeared through the driving rain like an apparition, his dark clothes soaked, his black hair plastered to his forehead. He had followed her, a silent, unseen guardian. He knelt beside her, his violet eyes filled with an emotion she could finally recognize: worry. "You are hurt." "My ankle," she gasped, shivering. "I think it's broken." Without a word, he examined it, his touch surprisingly gentle. His long, cool fingers probed the swelling flesh with an expert's precision. "It is not broken," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "But badly sprained. You cannot walk on it." Before she could protest, he scooped her up into his arms. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, holding her securely against his chest. Her first instinct was to struggle, to recoil from the intimate contact with this powerful, dangerous creature. But the cold was biting, and the pain was immense, and his arms, for all their inhuman strength, were steady and safe. His body was cool, even through his wet clothes, but it shielded her from the wind and the worst of the rain. She found herself relaxing against him, her head resting on his shoulder. She could feel the unnatural stillness of his chest, the absence of a heartbeat, a silent reminder of the vast gulf between them. And yet, she had never felt so protected. He carried her down the mountain, moving with an effortless, fluid grace over the treacherous terrain. He did not speak. The only sounds were the howling of the wind and the drumming of the rain. She closed her eyes, overwhelmed by pain, cold, and a confusing swirl of emotions. He did not take her back to the town. Instead, he carried her to a small, abandoned hunter's cabin he must have found during his explorations. Inside, it was dry and sheltered. He laid her gently on a dusty cot and, with terrifying speed and efficiency, built a fire in the hearth. Within minutes, a small, cheerful blaze was pushing back the gloom and the chill. He tended to her ankle, binding it tightly with strips of cloth torn from his own shirt. His movements were sure and practiced. "I was a soldier, once," he said quietly, answering her unasked question. "Long before I was a king. I know how to mend what is broken." He sat with her through the long hours of the storm, keeping the fire fed, making sure she stayed warm. As the night wore on, her shivering subsided, and a fragile warmth began to steal through her. The pain in her ankle dulled to a throb. They did not talk much. They simply shared the small space, the silence between them no longer a battlefield, but a space of quiet contemplation. At one point, she looked at him, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. The harsh planes of his face were softened, the shadows in his eyes deeper. He looked ancient and weary and profoundly alone. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "Why are you being so kind?" He turned his head and looked at her. The firelight danced in his violet eyes. "Because," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I am trying to learn how to be worthy of a second glance." It was the most honest, most vulnerable thing he had ever said. It was a confession, an apology, and a plea, all in one. And it shattered the last of her defenses. In the warm, flickering light of the fire, surrounded by the storm, Ilara looked at the vampire king and saw, for the very first time, the man. And in his eyes, she saw that he was finally, truly, seeing her. A quiet, profound understanding passed between them, more intimate than any touch, more binding than any vow. The storm passed with the dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and glittering. Cation carried her back to Silver Creek, the morning sun casting long, peaceful shadows through the trees. When they reached the edge of town, he set her down gently, allowing her to lean on him as she hobbled the last few steps to the apothecary's door. Lyra met them with a face full of worry, which quickly turned to relief and then to a shrewd, knowing curiosity as she took in the sight of them, the Dark Lord and the injured girl, bound by a night of shared vulnerability. For the next week, as her ankle healed, a new dynamic settled between them. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, comfortable companionship. He would visit her each day, sitting in a chair by her window while she rested her leg. Sometimes they would talk, sharing more stories of their disparate worlds. Other times, they would sit in a companionable silence, reading their respective books. He was no longer trying to win her or reclaim her, he was simply, with her. He was learning the simple, human art of presence. Ilara found herself changing as well. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep and complex curiosity. She began to ask him questions about his kingdom, not about its laws or its power, but about its people, its culture. She learned that the cold silence of his court was a form of respect, that the lack of outward emotion was a sign of control and strength. She began to see his world not as a prison, but as a place with its own logic, its own beauty, its own ancient sorrows. One afternoon, he was describing the crystalline caves beneath his castle, the way the light from the phosphorescent fungi refracted through the massive quartz formations. "It is beautiful," he said, a rare note of softness in his voice. "But it is a cold beauty. A still beauty. It does not change. It does not grow." He paused, looking at her. "It is not alive. Not like the things in your world." The unspoken sentiment hung in the air between them, "Not like you." On the day her ankle was finally strong enough to bear her weight again, he came to her as dusk was falling. He did not sit down. He stood before her, his expression serious. "You are healed," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "Yes," she replied, her heart giving a strange, apprehensive flutter. "Then it is time for a choice to be made," he continued, his voice even. "I have stayed here, in your world, and I have learned. I have learned that your freedom is not a whim, but the very air you breathe. I will not take it from you again." He met her eyes, and his gaze was steady and clear. "So I offer you a choice, Elara. Not a command. A choice. You may remain here, in Silver Creek. Live your life as you see fit. I will return to Noctis, and you will never see me again. I will declare you lost to the mortal world, and my kingdom will accept it. You will be free, truly and completely." He paused, and the weight of his words settled in the quiet room. He was offering her everything she had ever wanted, everything she had risked her life for. "Or," he said, and his voice dropped, becoming softer, more hesitant than she had ever heard it. "You can return with me. Not as a political prisoner. Not as a decorative queen. But as my equal. As a partner. To teach me of the sun, as I will teach you of the stars. To bring warmth to my cold halls. To build something new together, something that is neither of yours nor mine, but ours." He took a half-step closer, his hands remaining at his sides, his posture open and vulnerable. "I cannot promise you a life of ease. My world is dark and strange, and my people will not understand you at first. I cannot promise to change who I am. I am a creature of night and stillness. But I can promise you this: I will see you. Every day. I will listen to you. I will honor you. And I will never, ever take you for granted again. The choice is yours. And I will abide by it, whatever it may be." Elara stared at him, her mind reeling. He was offering her two kinds of freedom. The freedom to be left alone, and the freedom to choose her own bonds. The simple, peaceful life she had found here, or a difficult, complicated, but potentially extraordinary life at his side. She thought of the cold halls of Noctis, of the silent, ancient court. And then she thought of the look in his eyes in the firelight, the feel of his arms around her in the storm, the quiet companionship of the past week. She looked around her small, safe room. It had been her sanctuary. But she realized, with a sudden, startling clarity, that it was beginning to feel like a cage of a different kind, a cage of safety, of smallness. The woman who had fled Noctis would have taken her freedom and run without a second thought. But she was not that woman anymore. She had faced down her fear. She had spoken her truth. And in doing so, she had found a strength she never knew she possessed. She met his gaze, and her heart, which had been so afraid for so long, was now steady and sure. "I will go with you," she said. A flicker of profound, overwhelming relief crossed his features, so swift she might have missed it if she hadn't been looking so closely. He did not smile, she still did not know if he was capable of it, but the harsh lines of his face softened. The ancient weariness in his eyes seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet, wondering light. "Thank you," he whispered, and the words were not those of a king accepting fealty, but of a man receiving a gift of unimaginable grace. The journey back to Noctis was nothing like her first passage into that realm. They traveled slowly, not with the urgency of a king returning to his throne, but with the quiet purpose of two people embarking on a shared pilgrimage. Caitian did not treat her as a delicate burden to be hurried along. He moved at her pace, pointing out landmarks, explaining the history of the grim, beautiful lands they passed through. He taught her the names of the pale, night-blooming flowers that grew in the shadowed valleys and the constellations that burned in the twilight sky. The world that had once seemed so alien and menacing began to reveal its secrets to her, its own stark and solemn beauty. He, in turn, listened as she spoke of her world, asking questions with a genuine desire to understand. He wanted to know about the seasons, about the tides, about the way sunlight felt on the skin. He was a scholar of the night, and she was his tutor in the ways of the day. They were two halves of a whole, each holding knowledge the other lacked. The chasm between them was still there, vast and deep, but they were building a bridge, one story at a time. When they finally reached the great fortress carved from the mountain, Elara felt not a returning dread, but a sense of purpose. This was not her prison, it was her challenge. The massive gates groaned open, and they rode into the central courtyard. The guards and courtiers who had assembled to greet their returning king froze when they saw her, riding not behind him as a captive, but beside him as an equal. Her face was not downcast, her head was held high, her expression calm and resolute. Caitian dismounted and then turned to help her down, his hands gentle and steady on her waist. He did not release her immediately. He kept her standing before him for a moment, forcing his entire court to witness the gesture of respect, the clear statement of her new status. He led her into the great hall. It was as cold and vast as she remembered, but it no longer felt oppressive. It was simply a space, waiting to be filled. The obsidian throne stood empty at the far end of the hall, a seat of immense and lonely power. Caitian did not walk toward it. He stopped in the center of the hall, in the exact spot where she had annulled their marriage, and he turned to face her. The entire court watched in stunned silence. "Ilara," he said, his voice resonant in the vast space, but intended only for her. "When we first stood in this hall, I gave you my name and my title. I offered you a crown. But I did not offer you myself." He reached out and took her hand. His touch was no longer cold and impersonal. It was a conscious connection, a deliberate linking. His skin was still cool, but there was a current of energy in his touch, a feeling of life, ancient and deep. "I cannot change the past," he said, his violet eyes holding hers. "I cannot undo the hurt I caused you. But I can promise you a future. A future where you will be heard, where you will be valued, where you will be seen. We will rule this kingdom together. Your voice will be equal to mine. Your wisdom will temper my power. Your light will find a home here, even in the darkness." He lifted her hand, and this time, he did not just hold it. He slowly, deliberately, brought her knuckles to his lips. It was a gesture of immense significance, an ancient vow of fealty from a king to his queen, an act of submission no one in that hall had ever witnessed. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, soul-deep respect. "Welcome home, my queen," he murmured against her skin. Ilara looked from his bowed head to the faces of the astonished court. She saw their shock, their disbelief, but she also saw a dawning understanding. Their king had not returned with a captive. He had returned transformed, bringing with him a queen who had somehow accomplished the impossible. She had taught the mountain how to bend. She had taught the night to value the dawn. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. She met his eyes as he straightened up, and in their twilight depths, she saw the reflection of her own light, no longer a flickering candle in the darkness, but a steady, burning flame. The future would be difficult. It would be a constant negotiation between two vastly different worlds. But as his hand tightened around hers, she knew, with absolute certainty, that it would be a future they would build together. Their story was not over. It had just begun.